Hey guys, this is Eggy, and in this video I am placing some practice problems that have to do with the introduction of integers. And let's get started. Now, in the first set of problems, all we're doing is finding the opposite number. Now, for instance, number 5. What's the opposite of number 5? Negative number 5. What about 10? Negative 10. What is the opposite of negative 2? Positive 2. Remember, we don't write the symbol usually for positive. If you just see a number with no symbol, then we can assume that it's positive. The opposite of negative 7 is 7. The opposite of 100, positive 100, is negative 100. The opposite of negative 52 is positive 52. The opposite of negative 11, 11. And the opposite of positive 13 is negative 13. It's really important that this becomes second nature to you. The opposite of each number. The opposite of a negative is a positive. The opposite of a positive is a negative. Now here we're just going to deal with absolute value. Remember these two little symbols here that surround the number. Usually absolute value always means that it's positive. Now there is an exception to this rule. Let's get some practice in. The absolute value of 3 is 3. The absolute value of 100 is 100. What's the absolute value of negative 5? Well, we know absolute value is usually positive. So the opposite of negative 5, or the absolute value, I should say, of negative 5 is 5. The absolute value of negative 12 is 12. What's the absolute value of negative 7? It's 7. The absolute value of negative 23. Now, if you see, we have a negative symbol outside of the absolute value. Now, in this case, what you do is you work inside the problem first before you even look at the outside. So, what's the absolute value of negative 23? It's 23. So we have the negative symbol here. So that means the absolute value of negative 23 is 23 times the negative we have out here. It's negative. So this is negative 23. The absolute value of 10. Well, we know it's 10, but the negative symbol is outside. So that means that we're dealing with a negative value, which is 10. Again, what's the absolute value of negative 14? It's 14. With the minus or the negative symbol outside, that means it's a negative number. It's a negative value, negative 14. Now, remember the inequality symbol, the Pac-Man symbol? I'm just going to draw that here. Remember, this is less than and this is greater than. Remember what I said with the pointy tip? The pointy tip is always facing the smaller number, and the mouth or the space is usually facing the bigger number. So let's practice some of these problems. Which is the bigger number here? Negative 23 or positive 100? Now remember the first rule. Positive numbers are always bigger than negative numbers. So automatically we know that the mouth is going to be facing 100. So we would draw this symbol and we would read it as negative 23 is less than 100. What about if we're dealing with two positive numbers? Now we both know that on the number line, 9 and 19 are on the right side of the 0. So we know these both are positive. We know that number 19 is clearly bigger. So we write 9 is less than 19. Remember that little point is always pointing to the least, or the smaller number of the two. What about the absolute value of negative 85 versus 78? Well, we know the absolute value is usually positive. We don't see any negative symbol outside of the absolute value, so we know we're dealing with a positive number. So it would really be positive 85 is greater than 78. The mouth is usually eating. Remember, Pac-Man is eating the bigger number. What about here? We have two negative numbers. We know that these two negative numbers are on the left side of 0, which means that they're smaller numbers. Now, remember the number line. Whatever number is actually closer to 0 is the bigger number. So we would write -1, -2, -3, -4. The 3 is actually closer to 0. So -3 is actually the bigger number. So -4 is less than -3. Let's try here. -7 and 0. Well, as I said before, 0 is neither positive or negative, but it is the starting point. And we know that -7 is going towards the left. So we know that -7 is the smaller number. So -7 is less than 0. Here we have the absolute value of -3 with a negative sign outside of the actual symbol, and 5. Well, let's start here. Cover up the negative symbol that's outside. What's the absolute value of -3? Well, we know that it's 3. But with this negative symbol, we know that this turns into -3. So it's -3 is less than 5, because remember, 5 still ends up being the bigger number. What about here? Two negative numbers, -10 and -7. Remember our number line example. It would be -5, -6, -7. And we know that if we go further down, we would actually hit -10. So this -7 is actually closer to 0. So we know that 0 is the bigger number. So it's -10 is less than -7. What about here? We have, what is the absolute value of -71, and what is the absolute value of -92? Well, we know there isn't a negative symbol outside, so we know that we're dealing with two positive numbers. So the absolute value here would be 71, and the absolute value would be 92. And we know that 71 is smaller than 92, so Pac-Man eats the bigger number, 92. 71 is less than 92. Now, let's try a different problem. Let's try to place all of these in order, from smallest to greatest, or smallest to biggest. Here we have the absolute value of -10, the number 5, the number 6, the absolute value of -3, negative, and number 1. Well, let's rewrite these. The absolute value of -10 is 10, and then it's 5, and then it's 6. Here, let's cover up this negative symbol first. The absolute value of -3 is 3, and then with the negative sign, it turns into a -3. And then we have 1. So now let's put them in order. The smallest number we have here is -3. Then we have 1. then we have 5, we have 6, and then we have 10. Let's try something else. Now we see we have 1, 2, 3, 3 numbers that we want to know the absolute values to. So let's rewrite these. We know we cover this up first. What's the absolute value of 5? We know that it's 5. With the actual symbol, the negative symbol that's outside of the absolute value, we know that the positive number turns into a negative. So this is -5. We have a 1. We have a 9. What's the absolute value of 19? We know it's 19. And here again, we see what's the absolute value of a -23? We know it's 23. But now we have a negative symbol, which turns it into -23. So let's write this in order, smallest to biggest. So which number is bigger, -5 or -23? Well, we know -23 is further from 0, so it's -23, -5, we have a 1, we have a 9, we have a 19. Let's continue with more practice problems. I drew the number line, and you should pause the video and give it a try. Try it either with the number line or without the number line. I like to visually show you guys that there are a couple of ways that you can see when you're solving additional problems or addition problems, I should say, with integers. Now, we all know 5 plus 3 equals 8, but how does that look like on the number line? Well, we would start here, the number 5. The second number indicates which direction we're going. We see that the 3 doesn't have a negative symbol, so it's positive. So we're taking it 1, 2, 3 spaces to the right, because remember, the right is positive. So we end up at 8. What about if we had 2 negative symbols? How would that look like on the number line? Well, let's start at -5. And the second number indicates that we're adding 3 spaces, but there's a negative symbol attached to the number 3. So that means that we're going to the left side, because remember, the left of the 0, because remember the 0 is our starting point, is negative. We're taking it back 3 spaces. I don't like to use that kind of verbiage because I don't want you guys to get confused. So that's why I always say we're adding 3 spaces to the left, because this is negative. 1, 2, 3. -8. What about -5 plus 3? Well, we start here. And are we going to the left or are we going to the right? Where there isn't a negative symbol here attached, so we know that we're going to the right. 1, 2, 3. -2. Now here, 5. We're adding -3. So are we going to the left or are we going to the right? We're going to the left. Because remember, the left is negative. The right is positive. So it's 1, 2, 3. And we land on 2. Now remember what I stated before. When you're adding numbers, what you can do is, if you're adding 2 integers that have the same sign, you add as you normally would and just attach the symbol or the sign that you see there. In this example, we saw +5 and +3. It gives us a +8. Here, we saw 2 negative numbers, -5 and -3. So we added as normal. 5 plus 3 is -8. Here we have 2 integers that have 2 different symbols. So we remember we don't add, we go ahead and subtract, because remember, on the sign, on the number line, we started at number 5 and we added 3 spaces where it's going to the right because it's positive, and that gave us number 2. It might be a little confusing at first, but we're going to keep practicing until you guys get it like second nature. It's going to become very easy for you guys. And here, again, we're dealing with a positive 5 and a negative 3. So we know that we're going to the left because it's a negative sign. And anytime you have a negative sign, you go to the left. Let's practice another set of problems here. We're still dealing with addition of integers. We know that 2 plus 8 is 10. But what about negative 2 plus negative 8? Well, remember on the number line, usually we would start wherever the first number is indicating, which is negative 2. Now we see that the second number indicates how many spaces and which direction we're going to. So we see that the number is negative 8. So that would mean that we would be going to the left side because it's negative. If we had a positive number, we would be going to the right side. Let me just draw the number line really quick so that you visually can see what I'm talking about. Let's put here. This is just for example purposes only. Might be a little crooked. Remember, 0 is always our starting point, right? So we're starting here with negative 2. And the second number is indicating that we're adding 8 spaces, but negative 8 spaces. So negative is usually towards the left side of 0. So we're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 spaces. Now, here's a rule. Adding any number with the same sign, what you do is you add the absolute value of the numbers and just attach or keep the same symbol that you see on the sign. Now, in this instance, what we could have done is just cover up the signs. 2 plus 8 is 10. And then we would have just added the negative sign. Let's try some more problems so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. Here we have the same symbol or same sign. So the absolute value of negative 5 is 5. The absolute value of negative 1 is 1. 5 plus 1 is 6. But let's not forget there's a negative, so we keep the negative. Another way you can do it is you see there's 2 negative signs and we're adding, so we know that it's going to be negative. And then 20 plus 10 is 30. Now we all know 2 plus 4 is 6. What about negative 3 plus negative 6? Again, we see that there's 2 negative signs, so we know that the answer is going to be, the sum is going to be negative. 3 plus 6 is 9. So it's negative 9. What about 5 plus 6? 11. 1 plus 6? 7. Now, the reason why these stay positive is because, remember, we don't technically write the positive sign. We always assume that if there's no sign, it's positive. Let's try a harder one. Negative 7 plus negative 3 plus negative 1. Where would you start? Well, we would start left to right like we normally would because this is all the same function, adding. So we see this is negative, this is negative, this is negative. So the sign stays as negative. The absolute value of negative 7 is 7. Or -7 plus -3 spaces plus -1 space. Remember, you can either do the number line, or you can just look at the signs and see that they're all the same, so they're negative, and then just add across like you normally would. 7 plus 3 is 10 plus 1 is 11. Again, positive signs. 7 plus 3 plus 1. We don't write the symbol of positive because we assume that it's already there. So 7 plus 3 is 10 plus 1 is 11. All right, guys. Let's start with some problems dealing with adding integers. Now, pause the video so that you can take a moment to actually copy the number line. I am using a red pen just so that you can see the difference between the black ink and the red pen. Let's start off with something simple. We all know 4 plus 1 is 5. 3 plus 2 is 5. But how would that look like on a number line? How would we show 4 plus 1 equals 5? Well, let's start here. Let's place a dot on the 4, and then we're adding 1. We can always think as this as a space. We see that the number is positive, so we know that positive numbers are usually on the right side of 0. Remember, 0 is our starting point. And if we're adding a positive number, that means that we're going to the right side. The numbers are getting bigger. So we would go 1 space, and it would be 5. 4 plus 1 is 5. Let's do another one. Let's say if we were at 3 and we wanted to add 2 spaces. Positive, remember, because there isn't a symbol here, so we assume that the number is positive. 2 spaces. 1, 2. Again, we're left with 5. 2 spaces. And we're starting at the number 3. But what if we wanted to deal with integers that had 2 different symbols, meaning a negative and a positive? Well, let's start here. Let's say we had the number line 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But we're missing something. We're actually missing the negative integers. So in this case, we would just add the negative numbers. Let's just extend this a little bit. -1, -2, -3. So let's say we wanted to add -3 plus 2. Well, we would start at -3, which we know is here. And we're adding 2 spaces. Remember, it's positive, so we know that we're going to the right. So 2 spaces would be 1, 2. So you would be left with -1. Now, another rule, if you don't want to necessarily draw the number line, when you're adding 2 integers that have different symbols, a negative and a positive, you usually would just add the absolute value. Let me just show you. The absolute value of -3 is 3. And the absolute value of 2 is 2. So we would rewrite it 3 plus 2 is 5. Now, if you see, that's incorrect. Because when you're adding 2 different integers with 2 different symbols, what you should be doing is subtracting and then adding the symbol of the higher number. So in this case, on the number line, we see that we would have to move 2 spaces to the left because we're dealing with a positive number. Now, I don't want you guys to get confused because usually in another section when you're subtracting integers, that rule applies about adding the absolute value and then just taking the symbol of the largest number. But that's not what we're doing here. What you're doing is that you're looking on the number line, you're dealing with a negative number first, and then you're adding the amount of spaces that's indicated on the second number. Now, because the number is positive, we know that we're going towards the right. If the number was negative, we would be going towards the left because remember, left numbers are negative, right numbers are positive. Let's try another one here. -6. We want to add 2 spaces. 1, 2. So we're left with -4. Well, let's try something like 4 plus 2. We would start here, 2 spaces, and we're left with 6. All right, guys. So in summary, when you're adding integers, we'll start off with some basic rules. When adding 2 numbers or any numbers, you take the absolute value and you keep the sign. Like for example, let's say you were adding 2 negative numbers. We know that -5 plus -1 is -6. You can either use the number line to show the amount of spaces, whether you're going to the left or the right, or you can follow this rule. You'll follow the absolute value of each number and then just keep the sign. For instance, the absolute value of -5 is 5, and the absolute value of -1 is 1. Let's say we wanted to rewrite that. That would be 5 plus 1 is 6. But remember, we can't forget the sign. So we have to go ahead and make sure that it has the sign. 3 plus 2, as we know, 2 positive numbers is going to equal a positive number. But when you're dealing with adding different signs or numbers with different signs, what you can do is find the absolute value of the numbers and then subtract the smaller number from the bigger number. For instance, -10 plus 2. You could rewrite that. The absolute value of -10 is 10. And we go ahead and we know that number 2 is smaller. So it's 10 minus 2 is -8. And you keep the sign of the bigger number. So that's why it became a negative, because we kept the negative of -10. Again, let's try this. -20 plus 5. Well, we know the absolute value of -20 is 20. And remember, we turn it into a subtraction. 20 minus 5, because 5 is the smaller number, it's -15. Remember, don't forget the sign. Usually, I'd like to think of it automatically as when I see an addition problem dealing with 2 integers with different signs, I automatically know that I have to subtract the smaller number from the bigger number. I don't bother rewriting it, but it takes a lot of practice. So for instance, if I saw -15 plus 2, I know that it's automatically -13 because it's 2 different symbols, and I know that I have to subtract the 2 from the 15 anyway. Let's say we had -3 plus 7. Even if they decided to rearrange it, we know that -3 is going to be minus from 7 because -3 is the smaller number. So we know it's 4 because we always keep the sign of the bigger number. The bigger number in this case was 7. Now here, I remember in the timeline, remember we know that -15 would actually be bigger than 2 on the number line. But when you're dealing with addition, you're going by the absolute value. Which number is bigger in the absolute value? The absolute value of -15 is 15. The absolute value of 2 is 2. Which is bigger? 15. So we keep that sign. But remember, I know it sounds a lot of rules to remember, but it will become very easy as you practice. when you're dealing with adding integers with different symbols, you know automatically if they're the same sign, you add as normal and you just keep the sign. Or if you're adding two numbers that have two different signs, a positive or a negative, regardless of whether they're writing the negative first here or they're writing the positive first, we know it's still going to be a subtraction, always. Okay guys, that concludes this video on adding integers. If you want to see more on integers, feel free to click on the link below on the description box. I have more videos dealing with integers as well as the introduction to integers. If you guys have a specific math problem you guys would like to see me work out, always feel free to leave a comment or email me. Subscribe, give this video a thumbs up so that other students can see the videos as well. And again, if you have a question or just want to leave a comment, feel free to do so on the link below. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a good one.